Well, good morning, or almost good afternoon, good midday, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this plenary session, which is the last session of this highly interesting conference. And this is a very hands-on session because I have panelists who I will introduce to you in just a second, who are in many regards very hands-on and who have to find responses on the ground to the main challenges and to the many challenges that cities face. We've heard a lot about challenges to cities, but we also know that cities are greatly enough open spaces, very often very liberal spaces, and that also makes them vulnerable. And to see how cities can be made less vulnerable and remain open will, I guess, be one of the red threads that we have in this panel. We're very happy to have Dan Eliasson here, who's the National Commissioner of the Swedish Police, and Dan Eliasson will also give us an insight into his work, a short keynote. And I have a fantastic panel with Anna Karlstedt, who's the National Coordinator Against Violent Extremism. Thank you very much for coming here. And now, with the male panelists, I go from left to right, just very simply. So Bernard Hogan-Howe was the former Commissioner of Metropolitan Police in London. We've just spoke about it very quickly. Obviously, there was some event this morning on the tube in London, but there's no further information. But you definitely can share quite a bit of experience with you as to how a metropolis like London deals with these challenges. Fredrik Jordell is the Deputy CEO, the City of Stockholm Executive Office. Thank you very much for coming here. And last, but definitely not least, is Erik Wennerström, who is the Director General of, probably I have to say, BRA, the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention. So thank you very much for coming here. Dan Eliasson, if I may ask you to come and give us a short keynote. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I don't know if you say good morning at this time of the day, but it's a great pleasure to be here today and to participate in discussions on matters which are so keen to our heart, namely the security and safety in our cities. Due to the development of society in recent years, the police are now facing a variety of demanding challenges. There are more and more people, and growth is taking place mainly in the large cities. Problems involving shootings, lethal violence, and criminal groups mainly occur in the suburbs of large cities today. Those who are the most active in crime are young and have an active drug dependency. It is within this group that organized crime gangs find their recruits. I will speak a little bit about that in my keynote address here in the beginning. But let me first remind us all that we are in Sweden. Sweden is a safe country, a strong welfare society. And when we talk about vulnerable areas, we talk about vulnerable areas in Sweden. It cannot be compared to vulnerable areas in different parts of the world. You must see it through the eyes of Swedish glasses. I want to remind you about that. Well then, last spring the police presented a report on the situation regarding 61 residential areas in Sweden. The report shows that there are approximately 5,000 criminals and 200 criminals networks within these areas. The report shows that we now have more vulnerable areas than before, and there are cases of murders, public shootings, violent riots, assaults on blue light personnel, and open drug dealing in these areas. In the most vulnerable areas, we see parallel society where criminals do have established an alternative administration of justice and where there is low public confidence in the fundamental institutions of society. Today we have a better picture of the problems in the vulnerable areas in our country. These areas are struggling with problems, while at the same time the majority living in these areas are law-abiding citizens who want to do the right thing and work and study. There is a positive development in some of these areas, but it takes time to build sustainable social developments. We are, of course, working very actively in these suburbs. We are reinforcing resources locally, and we do prevent and detect and investigate crime. One of the most important parts is to work on increasing public confidence in the legal system. We need to get more people to have trust and confidence in the public system and in the law enforcement institutions. There are great forces and many safety building initiatives at work in the vulnerable areas. That is cooperation with local public transport and housing corporations, safety and security walks where the physical environment is checked, night walks and adult watch groups. We have neighborhood watches and social intervention groups, and all these people and groups, they do a fantastic job to assist the police to create safety in the areas. And what is important now is that we continue to deepen that cooperation in the future. The police cannot itself be successful in this area. We also have a strong cross-border cooperation or strong cross-agency cooperation against organized crime in our society. Government has been very clear to all our agencies that you should cooperate against organized crime locally. That means that we have, for example, the Swedish Enforcement Agency, the Swedish Tax Agency, the Social Insurance Agency, Customs, and so on, to assist us in fighting organized crime at the local level. That is a key task for other state authorities, important to remember. What we need to do is, of course, to further increase our resources in these areas. We have shifted the resources from areas with the rather low criminality to areas with higher criminality. But we also have to increase the conditions, improve the conditions for our police officers. When they are working in the vulnerable areas, they are working in very tough environments. Routine intervention often lead to intimidating situation, and more police stations in the most vulnerable areas are in need indeed. We need to be on the place, we need to be more, and we need to have stronger links to the population living in the vulnerable areas. We invest a lot of money in technical devices to prevent crime. We have surveillance cameras, we have shots and explosive detectors, drones, and technical operations and so on. That is important, but the key question is to be present and to build confidence with those who live in the area. The crime prevention work, I'm sure Mr. Erik Wennerström will talk about that more, is very important for us. We are being assisted in this by municipality police officers and local police officers. We make commitments to the citizens. We call it citizens' commitments. We have social intervention teams, volunteers. We have safety efforts and joint cooperation to build a sustainable social development in the areas. We also find the situation in the vulnerable areas to be very local, and it needs to be addressed locally. At the same time, we see that the situation in the vulnerable areas have strong links internationally. So we are using our international instruments strongly in order to combat crime in the vulnerable areas. Europol, Eurojust, the Schengen rules, the Prüm rules, all of them, they have important for our ability to be successful in these areas. So organized crime at local level needs to be fought also at international level. I want to conclude my introduction by saying that building confidence with the local society is the key to success. We need to be in the vulnerable areas from the police authority for long terms. For long term, we cannot come in with 3 cars during a day and then leave. We need to be posted, we need to be located, we need to have stations in the areas, and that is a move towards that ambition. We need to work with the local population to create confidence. We need to work with the local municipality. We have shall we say, the luck of having a government who has instructed other state agencies to work together with us to fight crime locally. And with the resources that the government has now stated that we should have in the future, it's huge increases in our budget. With a new organization, which was very, very, very difficult to establish, but now starts to function well. we have in full national powers, and with the legislator which is actually listening to us very closely on our needs, I think we have good possibilities to reverse the trend in these areas. And that is something that must happen, because the alternative is frightening. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And if you allow me, I'd also would like to pick up one of the key elements, and from previous quick conversations we've had before the panel, it seems to be something that is very important for all fields, and that is the cooperation with the communities within, let's put it, problematic areas. And historically speaking, of course, we don't see for the first time problematic areas in big cities. The other day I was in New York, and what is now a tourist attraction in the Lower East Side was a scene of crime in the 20s where Irish, Jewish and Italian mafia groups were very active in organized crime. So Bernard, I wanted to ask you, building trust with the communities in order to help basically isolate, if I gather what you said correctly, to basically isolate those who could be terrorists within organized crime, the big bullies, actually. How do you do this? What kind of experiences do you have from your police work in London? How do you make the Bobby a nice guy who's to be trusted?
Or woman.
Or woman, sorry. Shouldn't have happened to me.
No, I think it is quite difficult, because what has happened over the years to, I think, all police forces, is that we're expected to respond quickly. Mm-hmm. And what that drives us to do is to answer the telephone, probably email now quickly, and then we get into a vehicle and we attend the incident.
So quick response.
But that's helpful to reassure, it makes people confident you are available. You answer the phone quickly, you attend quickly. What it doesn't do is build trust. It builds trust in that event, but you have no relationship. It seems to me that a big challenge for police chiefs is, how do you dedicate people who only walk, is really vitally important. Not always. In rural communities, sometimes you still have to drive. But you establish relationships with head teachers, perhaps places of faith, local charities, that you actually know as a person. And the thing, in my experience, which builds trust for the police, is that you tell me something, and I do something about it. I keep my promise. It may not be that you can resolve the problem, but certainly all the research shows is that the very least you can do is go back to the person who told you something and explain what you did. And over time that builds trust. It happens in normal human relationships, but I think for the police it's vital that you have that feedback link. But what you can't expect someone to do if you've walked down the street once is that they will tell you that guy there is a burglar, that guy there is a robber. It will need relationship.
You walk the streets quite a couple of times.
Yeah,
you have
but
to
it
be
is
present.
But it is a challenge to say 10% of your organisation are going to do nothing but walk with long-term benefits. I can't tell you I tend to think quickly.
Is there an understanding in your organization that this is really important existential work? Walking in your communities, knocking at doors, talking with people, having a cup of tea with them, chatting.
Yeah, I believe so.
Knowing the local barber who hears all the stories in the community.
Yeah, the barbers are very good actually. But what you find is that often that people with more experience are more prepared to do this, because they have found that short-termism, quickly responding, delivers one solution, but not a 2 years solution. And one thing that we've experimented with over the last 3 years in London, we have a scheme called Police Now. These are people who are graduates who never have thought about being a police officer. So we say, right, if you are prepared to do this, these are people with a 2-1 degree or higher, they're very bright people. We'll give you a contract for 2 years. You will only work in the communities. So this is a specialism. If you want to stay after that, you can be a police officer. If you don't, we will give you a good CV and you can go on and do something else. The first batch of people who've gone through that, now 82% are staying. So we're getting good people, but that's their career. We want them to do that. But, for younger people perhaps, less experienced, there's an urgency. I've done it. You want to get in a car, you want to drive quickly, you want to respond and arrest at the time. But you keep going back. And the hardest problem is, how do you deal with chronic problems? And that does require investment. But it's a big challenge for police chiefs to say, I will put 10% of my resources and do nothing else that will deliver results in 2 years' time.
Let's stay with organized crime a bit, because from what I understand, we'll probably get into the situation where we talk about overlaps between organized crime, petty crime, and violent extremism. We'll definitely get there. But Erik Wennerström, I was wondering, this kind of building the trust, and obviously a very important point that you just made is you have to rely on experienced officers rather than the big bully who thinks that police work is kind of a drive in there, I'm really an important person, and I show people what to do, but it's rather the listening part. From your experience in crime prevention also, is that a good moment, this kind of private-public partnership in crime prevention? How do you get the people to do this? How do you get them established in the communities? How do you sort of isolate the bad guys from the guys who are willing, or the women who are willing to say, well, I'm not a snitch, I'm not an informer, but I really want this not to happen in my neighborhood? How do you do this on the ground?
Well, from our experience, and we work in some of the areas that the National Commissioner mentioned in his introductory remarks, we work closely together with the police. And in some of these areas, we use what we call a phase method, consisting in 3 different phases of policing, really. Where the first phase is the acute, the urgent, calming a situation down, and there's little room for dialogue there. It is really solving an urgent problem. Phase 2, however, is precisely the confidence building part. This is where things have calmed down, where there is an opportunity, window opportunity to establish relations. This requires more patience, but can certainly be done. And this is also during this second phase is where people start interacting with the police, where people start telling their stories. They are not afraid locking themselves indoors anymore. The third phase, however, is there's still crime going on in most areas, and the police have to perhaps different types of crimes than you find in the emergency phase. It can be vendors not declaring their profits or black market trading, etc. You have to go after that also before long, and at that moment, some of the persons that you had your confidence will turn against you again, because it's nice to buy cheaper things, goods than on the regular market. So you have to, and the bottom line of what I'm saying is that you cannot roll out one scheme across the nation or even all the 61 areas. You have to be extremely careful in dosing out these different phases in light of the local picture. That is really
when we talk about communities, Frederick Jodel, and I would also like to ask you, Dan Elias, the same question. When we talk about communities, we actually talk about different communities and also different publics. Now, when something evolves, not only in a community or in a no-go area where there's drug dealing, which is unbearable enough, but where shootouts and stuff like this, like Harlem in the older days, or from what I gather from you, something that I do not associate with peaceful, wonderful Sweden, but what obviously happens here, when this evolves into something bigger, then usually there is a call for stronger police force and just the opposite of what you were describing, tougher laws, harsher punishment, stricter regulations, tougher police, more police. Is that the right answer then?
If I start with the answer, I think, of course, that's a political dimension in that answer.
Well, because obviously gang shootings are unbearable and unacceptable.
But I would say that, in my perspective as a civil servant, to us, to be frank, it's quite clear that we have to be really repressive, to be more repressive than the dimension that these people are living under. They're more afraid of their neighborhood and what can happen to them than they are to the police, to be frank. You have that kind of structure in our vulnerable areas.
But then you have to win them over.
Yes, and to do that, I think I totally agree, of course, with Dan Eliasson's description of the importance of trust. Of course, that's very, very important for the municipality as well. But in one perspective, I could maybe add a perspective. trust for the police is very important, but in some aspects too late. And I think that's our role. We have to build that trust long before it comes to these very, very dramatic events of shooting and group violence. And this is what we try to do. Of course, very complex. A very long-term hard work is needed to build that trust before the police gets into the society. What have we done to create trust? Just one example, we try to work now with, we are visiting every firstborn, parents with firstborn kids. We are visiting with the child nurseries and people from the social services when they have their new baby at home, explaining what is the society, what is the Swedish society, what is Stockholm, how it's functioning.
What's the response
we try
so
to be
far,
there.
generally speaking?
Very good, generally speaking. And we have to maintain that work during preschools. We have to show the importance of putting your kid into preschools. Not everybody are doing that. We have to maintain the focus through the school system and further on through the lifespan. So we have to be there much earlier. And of course, the police would be there in the end of this chain, but we have to do this from the beginning.
Then it is much of prevention and fighting organized crime, and then we come to extremism also in a moment, is also about communication. From what I understand, it's communication with the communities, but it's also very much communication outside into the general public. Now, as a journalist, I'm of course totally allowed to simplify things. How would you go out after a gang shooting with 2, 3, or even more casualties, with citizens of Stockholm thinking that they cannot enter certain areas in the lovely city or in Malmö or other places, which is an unbearable situation and should not happen in open places like cities? You cannot go out and can tell them, listen, we need to have patience, and listen, we are visiting every family that has a firstborn child, and tell them about what Stockholm is and citizenship and democracy is. You basically have to communicate differently, but how do you keep a balance between, yes, we are there at it, or yes, we don't have enough personnel to deal with things, and yes, things stack up and we are not getting around to solve these murder cases. What do you tell them?
If you would have a very clear picture and answer on that question, you would be the best national commissioner in the world. Because that is exactly...
I assumed you're the best national commissioner in the
That
world.
is the most tricky question that you could ever imagine. Because from a media point of view, from a political point of view, from a general public perception point of view, when you hear dramatic things, you want to hear dramatic action.
And you want to have quick relief.
Strict beliefs. So you have to communicate, yes, completely unacceptable. We put a lot of resources. Generally, we have to speak a little bit about resources and more legislation. So in communication point of view, we need to be in that arena. But in practical, and also to a certain extent in practical terms, but in those situations, we do not solve things by muscles. We solve them by brains. We solve them by being there.
Smart resilience.
We need to be there, as you said. We have to, immediately, if something happens, a police car, a police patrol will come there and take evidence, and they will start investigations, traditional police work. But then when you talk to the local police officers who've been working there for a long time, they know immediately that must be the reason, the motives, the gangs to whom they belong, and you can start to have further information on how to deal with the crime. But in order to have that information, you need to be present locally. You need to be present locally and build the confidence.
Anna Karstedt, you were the National Coordinator Against Violent Extremism, and I could imagine this is a pretty broad portfolio. We've been talking about organized crime so far, but it seems to me that much of what has been said here about organized crime, there's an overlap sometimes with jihadism, because when we look at the biographies of some of the terrorists who committed terrorist crimes, they very often started out as petty criminals. Not really big, illustrious careers in crime, I might say, but petty criminals. Secondly, the whole issue about getting into the communities, getting them to perhaps also let the authorities know that something not so nice, foul, strange is going on within your own families. Is this a pattern that you find in the prevention or in dealing with violent extremism as well? And what would be your responses? And here we have an even more dramatic point, because once there is an attack, this is really a dramatic moment that is very emotional to most of the citizens who are immediately or directly sort of involved, attached to them. So how do you deal with that?
Yes, I totally agree with what you are saying about overlapping, and not only between organized crime and jihadism or extremism linked to religion, but that comes for all the environments. Right extremism, white power extremism, but also left autonomous extremism, and that is something that has been shown now recently in research. Scholars like my colleague Amir Rostami, etc., they have shown these strong links between the environments, and also that you can actually follow individuals going between these different environments. That can seem strange.
Going between kind of religious or political, more or less political extremism and crime?
Yes, that can happen too. So you see that there are links between them. I think what's important is to try to keep two perspectives at the same time. We talked here about what can be done at the local community level, and of course the debate now in society is very, very harsh, like you said, a demand for stronger legislation and also a more repressive policy, and perhaps we need more legislation, perhaps we need to look into that. But what we also need to do is to discuss what is happening before you come to the situation where you need to calm down a local community. What did you have in terms of prevention up to that point? And that I think we are not discussing enough. And also it's extremely important to look at the vulnerable areas, what is happening there, what is not functioning, but also to look into communities with the same challenges but which are actually working. And why is it working? What is the recipe? And there you see that a very close cooperation between the police, social workers, teachers, parents, grandparents, but also the civil society. When you have this very close cooperation and you are also giving the civil society resources, then things start happening. So you need a strong policy, you need justice that is working, but you also need to put a lot of resources into prevention, and that can be sometimes difficult to measure and sometimes difficult to describe. But what we can see in a long-term perspective is that that is actually what is working.
On the ground, from your experiences, how difficult is it to get this cooperation? We've just been talking about this. I'm a volunteer in a school with lots of students with a migration background. Most of them are 8 and 9 years old. And one thing very often teachers who are very engaged, very professional, are complaining about is we hardly get access to the parents. Many of them just simply don't care what's happening in school. And usually our standard answer to all of this kind of prevention is education. Now, if you can't get the parents on board when it gets to education, is this your experience as well, or is this just, is this, do you really also get to the parents? Because it's easily said to say we need to have these cooperation within the communities. Yes. How hard is it on the ground to get this really done?
Actually, of course, most parents are very engaged, but if that is not the case, there has to be other role models, there has to be other contexts. And what you are describing, that can be one piece of the puzzle, but it's also a question of leadership and personal engagement, because you can build structures, you can give resources to the local communities, but if the engagement is not there, then something is not happening. I just met the other day a Swedish guy who left. He left organized crime, he left drugs, and he left a Nazi organization when he was quite young.
Oh, she was busy in quite
Yes,
a few
exactly.
evil
So,
things.
but a typical case, because since we discussed these problems are linked, and I asked him, what made you leave? And he said it was an old, boring police officer in my hometown who grabbed me one day and said, I would like to have a cup of coffee with you. He refused, but the old, boring police officer didn't give up. In a couple of weeks, they had their first cup of coffee, and then they continued that ritual each week. And he said that perhaps it wasn't the fact that he was a police officer, because I hated police officers.
Perhaps he was a
But there
nice
was a
father figure.
But there was a human being, a father figure, who was willing to. I mean, he said, I hated myself since I was doing drugs, I was a Nazi, I was etc. But there was a human being prepared to actually sit down and have a cup of coffee with me. And the question is, was it because it was the police being present at local level, or was it because it was a personal engagement and a question of leadership? And I mean, his problem at home was that his parents and all four of his grandparents were engaged Nazis as well. So he could not get the support at home, but he could get it from his local community. And in my job, I meet stories like that every day. Sometimes you fail, sometimes you succeed, but the issue here is that you need both perspectives, and it was a very long journey for him to do that. But I think that this example shows that what needs to be done and how it could be done. And when we are also talking about evidence and methods that is working, how do you describe that personal engagement that could make all the difference, even though you have a good system in place?
Which of course means that you need enormous human resources, because the old boring policeman needs some 20 years in the police force to gather and gain the experience that he can then apply. I mean, this is we're talking about strategic patience, which we've been talking about in a totally different context in the panel on urban warfare, but obviously here it's needed as well. 2 days ago, Sir Bernard, I wanted to ask you this question. I had a panel discussion also with the German Interior Minister. And at one point he said, when it comes to terrorists, very often we have a different pattern. It's not the suicide terrorists anymore, it's people who want to get away. Secondly, they still want to have their 10 minutes, half hour of fame where they say we really have an impact. They very often, father figure, have a problem with strong fathers or too weak fathers. There is a problem with sexuality. There is, in certain communities, definitely. There is a problem of not feeling at home somehow. Now, when I look at all these indicators, I would say that makes police work really very hard, because this is not indicators that you can find via surveillance. What do you do when it comes to prevention, when it comes to not the aftermath of something that has already happened, but when it's about what's your main work, trying to prevent things from happening in the first place? How do you deal with these things? You cannot do this by cluster surveillance. You cannot do this by cameras. You have to have a totally different readout.
I'd not heard that list before, and it was a terrifying list.
It is a terrifying list.
But and I'm not sure I entirely agree with it. But I'm not sure I entirely agree with the thought that all people who are, I'm not sure you were saying this, but that all people who are terrorists have got a criminal background.
No, not all of them, but it very often happens.
I was going to say, which is that my experience is that, in fact, the opposite is true. So that what happens in people getting involved in terrorism, their motivation is about a political element. It is not about greed or violence. That doesn't mean to say they can't cross over. But our experience in the UK is that the first phase, I'm going to go back to that, the first phase of terrorism was less to do with criminality. And a piece of evidence is that of the people who've gone to Syria, it is said over 12,000 people went from Europe. I think 2,000 from France, I think around 1,000 from Germany. In the UK, it was approaching 1,000. Of that group of people who went from the UK, over 2/3 had not previously had any contact with the police or the security service. I say contact, they have not registered them as a threat.
So what are they attracted by?
Well, that's less clear, but my point is that you cannot assume that criminality will be a causal relationship with getting involved in terrorism. So that just as one point. That said, and I'm going to say something contradictory now, certainly in the UK we're moving into the second phase of generation of terrorism, where a lot of the people that we have arrested and put before the courts have been in prison for some time, and even if they weren't a criminal when they went in, apart from their terrorism, they've met people in prison called criminals. And when they come out, they've now got a very good network for getting hold of guns and other things. So that's a phase
they've
that we
did
have
some
to anticipate.
qualification works. They've got some additional skills.
They just know people that they trust. In the past, if you looked in the UK over the last 5 years, often criminals would come to us, the police, and say, someone's trying to buy a gun from me, because they often thought it was the police who was trying to sell it them. They didn't recognize this person. Much crime is familial. Organised crime, year after year, the same families turn up. So therefore, they trust the people they work with because they know them. Somebody new turns up on the block, they will tell the police, or somehow we will get to know this. That's not as much of it. That will become less of an issue as they get to know them in the prisons. So I think we've all got to anticipate that next phase. To your point about how do you notice somebody who is becoming terrorist, I'm not sure there is one particular thing that you need to look for, or even two things. We often say, you know, we ought to be able to tell that people lie by covering their mouth or whatever. It's often the thing that, in fact, notice about liars is that, in fact, they change their behavior. So if they're loud and become quiet, if they're quiet and become loud, that's the thing to notice. It's not one criteria. And the same is true for terrorists. So what we often ask people to do is to notice unusual behavior.
When somebody
to
really
notice
changes.
somebody who's starting to become radical, who's starting to express views of violence, and particularly when they've never done this before. And it may be because they associate that with a particular mosque. It may be with a particular speaker. It may be just that they're associated with a group who are of themselves worrying in their behaviors. So I think what we all need to do is to encourage people, whether it be a parent, whether it be a teacher, a lecturer, or a colleague, to say, actually, that's unusual behavior. Sometimes it can be explained away entirely innocently. They've changed their views of their religion. They've become more observant. That's not a problem. It's only when you associate it with trying to modify other people's behavior and the violence. So I think for me, that's the way that we've worked. And you've got to go back to some of the usual things that work. Police work works with people who are paid for information at times too. You know, historically, if people mix with these people, you have to give them another motive to give state information. So you have to think about informants. And you have to finally, for me, we talked a little yesterday.
Which we'd rather better not call informants, but cooperators, perhaps, because
Well,
informants sometimes have this negative,
Well,
kind of.
the label doesn't matter. That would be the informant I would use. But basically, you're paying for information, provided you're open about that, and you have to be in the judicial system. Unless you're going to make it illegal, you're going to keep doing it. But you have to discount the possibility that the only motivation is the money that you pay. They can't be allowed to create evidence. But I think it's important to keep on top of that. And the final thing is you have to accept that community-based policing is not the only method for getting information. It is helpful. I would say probably two-thirds to three-quarters of information may come that route. But the other third or a quarter may come from a foreign intelligence service.
Oh, absolutely. That's what you were pointing at in your keynote. This is what but let's keep in mind that this is not only a national or regional, or even, as you would say in Berlin, a Kiez affair, which sort of is relevant in a certain part of a city, but it's an international affair as well, right? Where there has to be international coordination. A quick look at my watch, and here this room is full of experts who are dealing with exactly the question you're dealing with. And I really would like to get you into the conversation. We have at least 2 or 3 microphones around here. So please, because it's not very easy from here to see, wave at me, do something. If you're not coming up with questions like, I threaten you with monopolizing the discussion up here. So you better ask questions and sort of notify that, yeah, here we have one.
I was thinking very carefully because I felt like I asked too many questions in this conference, but I decided to do that because this morning there was a terrorist attack in the tube station that I use every morning, Parsons Green.
Do we already know that it was a terrorist attack?
Yes,
Okay.
it's being treated as terrorism. Sadiq Khan has confirmed. So I guess London has. I come from Rio de Janeiro, where we have a lot of problems with criminality. So I'm starting to suspect that it's something personal with me. But London has a lot of problems with community, let's say, integration. Some communities are kind of isolated and in terms of being in their own bubbles, their own ethnic and cultural bubbles. And there are some urbanistic thoughts about how you can connect communities. So I'm just wondering if there's a relationship between crime and terrorism in London, if you can link both of these problems to this community integration in London, which is a problem, and if that leads to that feeds both into terrorism and crime, which would make for yet another linkage of crime and terrorism. And then the former commissioner said that 2/3 of the combatants that went to Syria had no previous criminal. But I think that 1/3 is still a very relevant number for the connection between crime and terror. So 1/3 is a very important number. So I guess my question is, is it relevant to work both for crime and terror prevention as one coherent strategy or two very linked strategies, or is it more useful to separate them neatly as it is currently being, I think?
Thank you very much. And perhaps I could have a follow-up question to you, also Eric and Anna, because this is so much about also prevention. We were talking about punishment not being the only thing, and now just Savannah mentioned that jails are really good skill enhancement factor for somebody who wants to do nasty things. Should there be something in between, prevention and informing the authorities and not sending these kids, I was about to say, into jail or threaten them with kind of, this form of punishment, but have something that helps them to get out before they get in, before they get their skill set enhanced. So Bernard, crime and terrorism separately?
Yeah, just on the announcement that's been made, that what Sadiq Khan has said is not inconsistent with it being very many motives. All he said is that they are treating it at this stage as terrorism, and within 90 minutes of the attack, they won't know. But they've sent terrorist police because there's been an explosion, it looks like there's a device, but the motive is not yet clear. So I think that's always the difficulty. At the beginning, with an hour, someone says, what happened? What do you want to call it? Journalists particularly, never journalists.
No. Journalists are very precise.
But you have to have a starting place for the team, and it will be the terrorist team to look. So I think that's all he's confirming, to be fair to him. In terms of community integration, I would say that London is a very good example of an integrated city. It's now 8.6 million people. 1 million people arrived in the last 10 years, and that is 1/4 of the population growth of the United Kingdom. We know that Europe generally is getting older, but northeast London is getting younger. That's partly because there's a mix of migration, partly a mix of birth rate. Every time you think of a number of a group of people, however described, there is a large number. I think now 350,000 French people. It's said to be the 5th largest French town. 180,000 Polish. I won't go right through the mix of people. Generally not all congregating together, but in some areas they do. But what I would say is that what you don't see, and I've heard of this in other places, where the police are excluded from patrol, or alternatively a different group of mores or morals or laws will be allowed to run. We had a period about 5 years ago, there was a vigilante group of Muslims. And when people walked down their street with open alcohol, they challenged them. Well, that lasted for about a week. They were arrested, and it was dealt with through the courts, but it didn't occur again. There was a period about 10 years ago where one particular preacher, who was linked later to people who became terrorists, was allowed to preach outside a mosque, close the road, and because of cultural sensitivities, that wasn't stopped. In fact, that's exactly what should have happened. The road should have been opened, they should have been stopped. So I think there have been the occasional periods, but I would argue generally integration is good. There is not separation, and there's good social cohesion. But I would agree with you that if those things are allowed to be embedded, then there are real challenges. So integration, inclusion are vitally important. To the final point, which we covered a little yesterday, but mentioned particularly as Dan's here, is that I do think it's vitally important for people like the police, but not only the police as a public service, to represent the community they serve. But going back to where I started, when in 10 years 1 million people arrive and the whole face of London changes quickly, bureaucracies like the police cannot change at that rate. So therefore you've got to be creative and constructive about how you're trying to mimic that. And standing in front, as I'm sure Dan does and colleagues do, of rooms like this in London, who are 70% from minorities, with a group of white colleagues, and saying that in 20 years we'll represent you isn't a good answer. Because sometimes there have been issues in the past that they need to see changed. So I think we've all got to be mobile and nimble with our response. But I don't necessarily agree that there is separation in communities.
Let me quickly ask before that, because that points to something that would mean, should police forces in general should there be a strategy to make police forces much more diverse in order to sort of really recruit people who have a different approach into different communities, because they speak the language, because they have the cultural codes, but because they're kind of a role model that represent we are on the side of the political order here. We are not a parallel order. We represent the political order of our home country. And so should you, Fredrik, can I put this question to you quickly? I mean, strategically thinking with a real, conscious, confident approach to reaching out to people to sort of recruit them into the police forces?
I think it's better that Don answer for the police.
Gets the question next, but it gives him some time to think.
Let me say that we have the same discussion in the city of Stockholm, of course. So I think, of course, you can find some of the solution there. I think it's good. I just want to add one more thing to make it even more complex. I think, of course, there's a relation between the vulnerable areas linked to the criminal acts and terrorism. But to make it even more complex, if you look at the situation of Stockholm, we had 2 terror attacks, one attempt in 2010 and now in April this year. And if you look at those situations, the first was made by a person born outside Sweden, came to Sweden in the 90s, a resident of Luton, had nothing to do with the city of Stockholm. The other attempt, a paperless person who wasn't allowed to stay here, not a citizen of Stockholm. So the ideas of building trust in a society to make diverse organizations, of course, that's good. But unfortunately, the situation is even more complex.
You have sort of the foreign fighter, the international, the globalized aspect of this, then Elias, and how do you deal with that then?
I wonder, Fredrik, whether I agree completely with you on your description on the perpetrators of the terrorist attacks. You say they were not citizens of Stockholm, but they were still living in Stockholm. And of course, we need to take that into account. We need to create system whereby through which we can create links and confidence also to these guys, be them legal or illegal. To your question, Silke, you asked us whether there is a need to have more diversity in the police forces, and of course the answer is clearly yes. But I realized during the years I've been the commissioner right now that it is not as simple as you think. Because sometimes you think, okay, bring new ethnicities and be sure that the police force mirror the population as such. And then you will have people who can, with cultural knowledge, language and so on, can deal with problems of their own ethnicity. But first, so if we manage to get a guy with Somali background, knowing culture, language and everything, is it so simple that he should be sent to the Somali group?
No, I think he shouldn't be burdened with it, but it should be an extra skill within the police force.
Exactly.
We cannot outsource it to your community.
Exactly.
You deal with it.
You need to bring in the cultural knowledge, but you have to be very careful so you don't entrust the police work to the same ethnicities or something like that. So it's not that simple.
Yeah.
But we need to increase our diversity, definitely.
There's a parallel. I mean, just in brackets, there's a parallel phenomenon in journalism. Wherever there are journalists with a migration background, who have Turkish names, the huge mistake that always happens is they're entrusted with deal with Turkey.
Yeah.
That's not even their field.
No.
So that, of course,
Exactly.
would be a major mistake,
Yeah.
right? I have a question here, but I still then want to go back to the kind of what can we find in prevention that is somewhere between we don't even realize what's happening and we put them to jail. But I have a question here, Michael. Can we have a microphone here in the first right? Yeah.
ask you, or to the moderator, Tilke, to pick on what you just said in passing about the attackers nowadays not wanting to kill themselves, but rather to get away and still have a moment of fame, but then being caught. And now we have a number of terrorist actors having not just been killed in the action, but being caught, being able to be interrogated. We have a Swedish case, for example, done. So I was wondering whether that being the case, that you have several cases in Belgium, in France, in Sweden even, where the attackers have not simply given up their life, but are available for interrogation. Are we learning things from those in terms of whether the end of the caliphate will mean enhanced threat because of returnees or reduced threat because of lost attraction from the ISIS phenomenon in the sort of net version? Thank you.
Who wants to take the question? Eric. Can you take the question? Do you want to take the question?
Me?
Yeah. Whoever wants to pick it up.
No, you would say.
It's not something my agency has focused on, I must confess.
But I can.
Okay, Anna.
Of course, we can learn from people's experiences being the victims or being the portrayers. But what's important is, I think, that it's so extremely complex. If you look on the motives, they can be religious, but they can also be ideologic in a completely other way. It can be totally other motives behind it. So to keep that in mind, that it's always very complex. What we also can see is, of course, we can learn from history, even though we're not very good at that. I think learning from history, and that is that you see these cycles of terrorism that they live for a while and then they actually disappear. And why do they do that? Is it because of less attraction coming to the issues, or is it other things in society? I mean, if we look on the terrible terrorist attacks we had in the 70s, in the 80s, linked to more like separatist movements, or if you move to the early 1900s when it was more linked to anarchist movements and so on. Those phenomena, perhaps they haven't disappeared, but they are much less present in the world. I think that in 10 years' time, we will see that the strong terrorist movements we see today, they will be will be less strong, and perhaps even disappeared. You have these movements in time where it's actually so. But the question is, of course, what can we learn from the individuals involved, and how can we together on many levels, both on a local level and on a global level, try to prevent? Is it even possible?
Yeah. Dan, you also want to...
Yes, very shortly.
I'll have you.
Of course, Michael, we don't know yet whether we will have an increased number of attacks or not, following the developments in Syria and Iraq. But we prepare ourselves as it could be an increased number. And that is the reason why the security police, the national police at the local level, and the municipalities, and Anna and her colleagues, we work closely together to be prepared and to see whether we can find anything to prevent as quick as possible. So we prepare for the worst, but we don't know yet.
But perhaps I can add a bit of experience from Israel, because in Israel also people were called before they could commit a suicide attack and were questioned, and the security forces always tried to extract patterns, and whenever they thought they had a pattern, roughly, something new emerged. It's just like when we thought that Al-Qaeda was the most radical Islamist movement, guess what? You know, with ISIS we had an even more radical movement. Same parallel in Israel. When we thought the PLO was really radical, they were replaced by Hamas. Hamas was replaced by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is replaced by IS. So there's obviously room for even more radicalization. And then, mentally speaking, what I gathered from my work back there was that in open societies, specifically in cities, which are such a symbol of open societies, where we learn to live with one another, even with cultural differences, and we do very well overall, we have a hard time to understand sheer hatred. There might be a lot involved about, prevention, where you can get people, where you can prevent, but there's a certain number of people where sheer hatred really plays a role. And that might be a very, very small minority, and prevention is key. I would totally agree, but there are people who just really want something, who really want to destroy. I have a question over here. The gentleman very much in the back, if you stand up, it's easier to find you with the microphone. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Ian Anthony from Cypria. I have a question, I think, to the colleagues from the police on the panel, but it's building really on Anna's anecdote about the policeman who made a personal intervention with someone who he recognized as having a problem. As the nature of policing has evolved, could you say a few words about how that's reflected in training? When recruits go through police college, to what extent are these new problems already part of the curriculum? Can you shortcut this requirement for 20, 25 years of learning by doing on the street, by introducing new methods? And a second question, when you come out of police college and you want to build a career and you want to climb successfully, what are the things that you would prioritize? Are these the things that you would prioritize, or would you make other choices in terms of what you want to do to further your career?
Perhaps we ask Sir Bernard first, and then you could also tell us about how well did it work? Did police persons in London now wear cameras? What kind of effect did it have on behavior and on their police work?
Okay. In terms of the first point about do we train those skills, we do to some extent. But of course, as Anna explained about, in that case it was a police officer, there are other people who can have that conversation too. And one of the difficulties for the police is that, going back to the acute problem solving, and if you look in London, we had around 5 million telephone calls a year. You can work out the numbers for every day, and you had to attend those incidents. Now, unless your prevention is going to remove that possibility or half of it, that's going to be where the majority of your resources lie, the acute, the problem that you've got to resolve now, stop the damage and try and initiate some kind of response. So that's probably where it's going to draw the resources. So the longer term work with people, other agencies can help with. So for example, I don't know what the equivalent is in Sweden, but probation. So in the UK, people who leave prison have a probation officer who works with them to get employment. I think it should actually be, even if they don't go to prison, because often the three things that will stop further reoffending will be employment, relationships, and somewhere to live. They're the three big things that make a real difference for people. But so it's not only the police can have that conversation. So yes, I think to answer your question, we do some training, but we also expect other parts of the partnership, criminal justice partnership, to assist with that. And I think it is a joint enterprise. Therefore, in terms of your question, how do people progress vertically? I suppose what we generally tend to look for is leadership and management skills. Those are the two big things. Now, part of that, you could argue, is about talking to people, listening, and building on ideas and problem solving. So I think those are things. But I think it would be inaccurate to say that that was part of a great scheme that built it from the beginning. But our best people for talking to people are either community officers or detectives. Good detectives listen long and speak very little. You do far better by observing than you do by talking. Being on transmit is rarely an effective mechanism for being a detective. So those are two groups who I think on the whole are pretty effective. In terms of the points about cameras, I think I would make 2 points about cameras. I made a point yesterday about if police legitimacy is important, body-worn video I think is a good way forward for this. I was explaining that in London, I think in the next few weeks they've got 23,000, all the frontline officers will have body-worn video. And I made the point that I think this will replicate improving the quality of police behaviour on the streets as it did in the police station. If you're talking about the public surveillance, the surveillance of public space, certainly in London we found it incredibly effective at helping to stop, this stopped murder in the end, but certainly detection rates, because you can't move around many of our big cities. without public or private space being monitored by CCTV. It is not linked. There's a problem. So trying to get observance of 15 schemes. But probably the best example to give, I took over a few days after the London riots of 2011, when you will have seen 26 of the 32 boroughs had riots. And we arrested in the succeeding 18 months over 5,000 people. The only way we were able to do that was to put 800 people, 800 police officers, looking at 250,000 hours of CCTV footage. And it took that long because there was no IT. Now, we arrested...
Now, with artificial intelligence and better algorithms, we could probably...
Well, possibly, although we had an interesting discussion this morning. That's not always the perfect answer, but it was people-intensive because it wasn't a linked system. And 70-odd% of the people who we arrested were charged, and 90-odd% of those charged pleaded guilty. That's a very high percentage because they could see the very evidence that... so I think it's a very powerful tool, one, in detection, but sometimes in deterring those who have rational behaviour. If it's irrational, led by drink, psychiatric illness, terrorism, and they want to die, it will not deter. But I think it's a powerful thing. If you align that with things like...
But you would say that most of it is rational behavior, and irrational behavior is a much smaller number from your experience?
You could argue it's rational to commit suicide in the process of killing other people. I regard that as irrational.
No, I think we would agree that this is irrational.
So I think I would... But my point I was going on to make was that if you combine something like CCTV with automatic number plate recognition, it starts to give you a powerful tool. There ought to be proper controls of this, rights that start to, but those two together, and things like CCTV, you could start to have microphones which don't register speech, but do when there is violence in the street, and they will therefore direct your attention. And so I think there are clever things coming along, but it's not the answer. But it helps to mitigate some of the threat, and particularly around detection.
Dan, would you like to also pick up this question? Well, I think that...
I can echo the words of Sir Bernard. I could echo the words.
You could echo the words.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have to pick it up then, because it would be the same. But I assume that the matter of video surveillance, which is a pretty good tool in the whole tool set that we've been talking about, is something that is received differently in different societies, because it's a privacy thing. Just at this in Germany, we have had a huge discussion. How is that in Sweden? Is this?
We're in the midst of that discussion. As you said, after the terrorist attack, of course, questions came on whether we need to sharpen our legislative instruments, and cameras was one of the questions. We are just about to have a new committee investigating whether we could increase the use of camera surveillance in our society. And from a police point of view, maybe the deterrence point isn't that strong. But backtracking evidence and so on is extremely strong. And for example, at the terrorist attack in April in Sweden, we managed to backtrack the guy, and that was very important for us to find him quick. So strong reasons in favor of camera, indeed.
Thank you. We have 3 more minutes. If this question is really quick, we can still take it. Mike's not coming, Mike's running.
No, I just wanted to get back to the cups of coffee, because I think we've heard so many sunshine stories about cups of coffee making all the difference. And I was just wondering, how do you create incentives for this kind of personal engagement within organizations? Because if it's based on voluntary initiatives, it becomes quite vulnerable. So how do you do that? How are these type of personal engagements measured and valued within an organization? Perhaps it also links to the question posed by Ian Anthony on training. I would be quite curious to have an answer on that.
Anna, please, go ahead.
Actually, I feel a bit responsible for that sunshine story. And of course, perhaps you have seen these YouTube clips where you say that everything in the world can be solved by Swedish fika or Swedish coffee. It's not that simple, of course. I mean, what is important to take your question seriously is, of course, what I then we come back to where we started, that we need to keep at least two perspectives in sight at the same time. Of course, we need effective legislation. Of course, we need effective structures.
It's not an either-or question.
And we need resources. But if we have all that in place, if you don't have that personal engagement, you won't succeed anyway. And then it comes to leadership, I think. To express, I mean, this is one of the biggest challenges we have now in the society. If you take that seriously, you need resources, you need structure and policy, but you also need to express leadership. And if you are the boss of those boring elderly policemen, you have to express, of course, that yes, the cup of coffee is important, the legislation is important, and prevention is important, and of course crime fighting is important, to keep all this track of all these perspectives at the same time. But we can have anything and everything in place. If you don't have that engagement, I think we will fail anyway.
I think it could not be put more nicely to wrap up the challenges that we have to make cities secure in insecure times. I mean, to time and again remember that this is really a long-time project, both when it comes to crime and when it comes to terrorism. That this depends a lot on resilience, that it depends a lot on experience. I was about to say, you know, more walking, less talking, more presence, of course legislation, and to keep in mind that this is a tool set that is very, very broad and is based on cooperation between different groups and cannot be sort of pushed on a certain force in order to deal with it and get it out of our way. Well, let me thank our panelists. Thank you very, very much for your insights. I really have to say I absolutely like these hands-on panels where people with tons of experience talk about their experience. So let me thank you for that. And let me thank you, dear audience, also for your questions and for your attention. And now I would like to ask Jan Eliasson to come up to us and speak a few words as the chair of the governing board of SIPRI. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Jättefint exempel. Underbart. Hej, tack för igår. Hey, very good, Silke. Thank you. Thank you very much, Silke, and thank you, panelists, for an excellent hands-on panel. The reason why Dan Eliasson lingered here was probably that we are almost interchangeable. There is only one letter dividing us, the letter D and J. And we have a number of occasions where I've received his mail, his telephone calls. The funniest experience we have is that Dan told me that he came back from Geneva and he had been royally treated at the Hotel Intercontinental because I was mediating the war between Iran and Iraq, and we probably paid thousands and thousands of hotel bills to Hotel Intercontinental, so I was a VIP guest. And Dan checked in and got the suite with flowers, fruit and everything. I don't know whether you told him when you left or when you arrived that it was... Anyway, so glad to be with you. And a wonderful panel. And as Silke said, it was a very hands-on panel, and I like that. This is the whole approach we have to this conference. Dan and I and Jakob and Michael have talked about that, how it is important that we see this subject as a microcosm of all the huge issues that we have to deal with today. So I thank you very much. But before I proceed with my comments here, I will just want to tell you that our wonderful film team and technical staff have actually done a snapshot video, a 4-minute highlight film that will come up now, because we talked about the problem of this conference with this intellectual a la carte menu of such huge size that we need to be cloned in order to do the real job, to follow the subtext, the sub-subject, so to speak. And now we'll see whether we can get a glimpse of the conference that we will now have rolling in front of us. So over to you.
I I'm neither an expert nor do I have a mandate to deal with the security challenges. What I can say, however, that I am here in this important symposium to examine the relationship between security and mass and forced population movements.
Governments have to show a lot more political courage. That would then, in practical terms, mean you would have programs of public education, public information, where people could understand why things are happening. Why are all these people being forced to migrate?
The theme is secure city in an insecure world. A great opportunity as well for us to have a discussion with other people from internationally here in this conference.
I'm from Nepal. I'm Additional Inspector General. I'm from Nepal Police. And I came here to address, make a presentation on violent extremism and urban violence in Asia and Nepal.
I've been delighted to hear from many heads of international agencies who are brought in, and to hear particularly about Sweden's perspective.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please rise for His Majesty the King and Her Royal Highness, the Crown Princess.
Welcome to this second security conference of CIPRI. The security of cities is in fact a microcosm, a miniature of the security needed in this world.
It's impossible to forget what happened on April the 7th this year.
What happens in one country influences places far, far away. We have tools at our disposal, technologies and international cooperation, but they must be developed.
There are 4 times as many extreme weather events now as there were a half century ago. That's a trend. If you don't see the trend, your eyes are not open.
Welcome to the conference.
This is a wonderful event because it's so topical. Cities play a great role economically, but also security-wise, as this conference shows.
We need to have dialogue between actors of violence, of insecurity, to get more security in towns.
What can business do? One of the things we've heard a lot even over this today is about how you make sure that all our society feels included. Well, one of the ways of inclusion is around employment, and if you get sections of society that are excluded or feel excluded, they're not getting jobs, they appear to be excluded because of their minority status, that's a very, very damaging thing for all of us.
It's actually at the city level where you have this multiple approach also to the challenges, but where you also can find a lot of the solution, and that CIPRI can be this kind of hub for sharing of not only ideas but also concrete action and ideas on how to act.
The conference is fantastically important because it brings together all of these experts from around the world who really know what they're talking about.
When change happens, old definitions and old distinctions between different specializations become less useful. And it's the task of a conference like this, through that mutual learning process, to break down the distinctions and create new understandings out of that.
Thank you very much, Lennart Söderberg. Really, this shows the power of sound and image, doesn't it, to send a serious message. Thank you very much for that wonderful work. It was a bit of a surprise to me, but did we do all that? I will not make a long summary of this conference, very rich in its nature and substance, as we saw here. I just thought of what are the lingering words in my head and heart after these 2 days, 1.5 day. And the first word that lingers is, of course, coming from this the latest panel, namely trust. I think trust and confidence is really now in deficit all over the world. I think we actually are facing a crisis for our institutions, and even if I were to go one step further for a test of democracy, that we really have functioning institutions and that we have trust in those who lead those institutions, whether it is political leaders or civil service personnel. It's very important for us to make sure that there is not a big gap between citizens and the leadership. And we have had in history where acceptance of leadership and institution has been automatic. But now in this day of communication and revolution, in the form of the new technology in our pockets, we have a situation of enormously high expectations, in my view, and also a trend to go in the direction of instant gratification. And there we must know that these expectations are very much rising. And everything we can do to instill confidence in the cities, of course, but also in the larger context. This has even become a part of the new UN Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 16 talks about the importance of transparent, inclusive institutions as a means of development and by also reaching peace and security. The second word that lingers in my mind is interdependence, of realizing that we have to go horizontal. By that I don't mean go to sleep, by the way, but that we have to recognize that everything is interlinked: peace, development, human rights, but also the different actors, parliaments, governments, civil society, the academic life, private sector, all of us. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And I just want to give one brief example of interdependence as I saw it during my last year at the UN. I was there 5 years until the end of this last year. And I was surprised that what I saw had an effect on cities. I went to Vietnam. I went to the Mekong Delta. And I saw was a pretty depressing sight, because the level of water in the Mekong Delta has gone down considerably, mainly because of dam buildings in neighboring countries. But it has been made extremely complicated because the lower level of the fresh water means that the salt water from the ocean comes in the Mekong Delta in massive numbers, and with enormous effect on the economic life, because the salt water contaminates the rice fields and kills the freshwater fishing life. So those who are fishing in that enormous delta have no way of making a living. And the farmers whom I visited, I spent a whole day going around in the area seeing farmers and fishermen for the UN. And we had started a program. They had no living. The cattle was getting sick and died, and the farms could not subsist. And by the way, from the sea, at the sea, I saw, they told me, and the UN experts confirmed that the sea level rise had led to about 20 meters of the coastline disappearing in 10 years. And of course that adds to the salt water coming in with the rising sea level. Now, where did these people go in Vietnam who had no living as fishermen and farmers? Well, they went to the big cities. And this is just a miniature of Vietnam, still a big country, but you can see the same trend in Bangladesh, in India, I guess, in Myanmar, Burma, all over. And we see the same thing now with the environmental refugees fleeing, the droughts and the floods. Remember getting a cable from a friend in the humanitarian community after a flood in Pakistan. And he said, it was the flooding of the size of Sweden. Sweden is as big as France. Do you know that? It's geographically huge. And he said, listen, there is this enormous flood, the whole area is underwater, the size of Sweden. And he said, so much water, and not a drop to drink, because all the freshwater resources are gone. Those people disappeared into cities, at least temporarily, maybe even permanently. Third word is prevention. It's such a word of rhetoric, and I've been discussing it since the early 90s, in different contexts, Sweden, UN, everywhere, European Union. I tried my best to innovate by having a very concrete program in the UN. It's called Human Rights Up Front. We wanted to see human rights violations as the first sign of a conflict coming, the vibration. The vibrations in the ground. If there is human rights violations, you know it's going to be a problem. Problems that in the end could turn out to not only an internal conflict, but a regional conflict. That was a way of trying to make it more concrete. But you in this room have discussed so many of preventive action. One of the most interesting aspects is how you have been, on the solution side, trying to identify the prevention, the need for prevention. Even in this last session here, we had examples of prevention in the wonderful form of my fourth word, namely personal relations. Anna's story made an impact on all of us. Sarah Myrdal picked it up. I said to Sarah, you just stole my line in my conclusion, because I was just thinking that in the end, and I speak from many years of experience in both in politics and in diplomacy, in the end, it's often a case of personal relations, whether you achieve something or not. I once read a novel by a Swedish novelist, by many forgotten, but a wonderful novelist. His name is Eyvind Jonsson for the Swedes. He wrote a novel about a young man coming from the north of Sweden for very simple circumstances, and he made it high, big in Stockholm. And a line which I'm trying to identify, if the Swedes may want to help me, that I read when I read this book, 26 years old, was the one line that sort of lingers with me still at a much later age. It simply says the following. It was only about his success. It was only when he dared be personal that he started to conquer the world. And I can look back at my life in both politics and diplomacy, that the moments where I really think I've made progress are moments of the kind of the elderly policeman at his free time going to a cafe and having coffee with this young man. But also in many, many other situations where you catch the moment of a personal relationship. And that reminds me of something absolutely basic, apropos the first word that I want to remember, trust. We must accept personal responsibility. Responsibility. We talk about basic human rights. We should remember we have also basic human obligations. Rights are also requirements of duty, and accepting that we have a personal responsibility. And we in this room, who are well educated and who have often power in our fingers and can have an impact, we have a duty to use that power. And I think this is what this conference is all about, is to make sure that we see the tools that are there, but that we also use them in our work. And I like the fact that we did use this microcosm of cities to be the catalyst for discussion about these very important issues. So Dan and I and Jakob and Michael, we discussed yesterday whether we were ripe enough to announce here what we are going to make for theme for the following conference. Because of the richness, the diversity of views, we are not there yet. And we are open to your suggestions, I'm pretty sure. Dan will say a few words now after me. But we would very much like to be as hands-on as possible, but still not lose sight of the larger issues which are at stake. So stay in touch with all of us, and thank you very much for taking part in this wonderful conference. For me, the first time as chair of the governing board of CIPRI, and I realize that I have quite a responsibility myself, which I will accept from now on. It's a 5-year term, so count on me here. Thank you very much.
I'm going to stand up higher so I can see you better. Thank you very much, Jan. We're nearly at the end. I'm the last thing. After me comes lunch. After lunch comes the bus. After the bus, whatever. A couple of things which I need to say, but before I do, I just want to sort of reflect very briefly about the scope of what we've been talking about. I mean, you know, not being too trite about it, but from the global compacts that Filippo Grandi was emphasizing the importance of these to he probably wasn't that boring, actually, that old police officer. He probably wasn't that old either, not from where I stand, but that guy, from the global compacts to that, from the cup of coffee and its role in security to artificial intelligence and its role in law enforcement, from the coffee shop to the private sector, from Raqqa to localities everywhere, far, far, far away. Localities close at hand in Stockholm and localities in West London, Parsons Green, in Istanbul and other places. So the range has been enormous, and I think, I hope you agree, and we would love to hear some feedback from this in the days and the weeks ahead as you get home. I feel there's been a great benefit about bringing these different discourses together and bringing these different constituencies together, and that we've found a common language and a common vocabulary to start talking about these. And I think one of the things which I'm most struck by, and it's between something which I've thought for a long time and often say, and something that I think it was Sir Bernard Hogan Howe said, but the principle was mirrored by several other people. Whenever I think about community, I think about the relationship between community and security in the long term. Building communities and societies so that the problems that we are worried about are minimized as far as possible. But also community engagement, inclusive communities, equality and justice and fairness in society is also needed so that there is enough trust that there can be that communication, which provides short-term security as well, getting the information about who might be the troublemaker. So whichever way you look at it, you have to get the local level into account. Whether, you know, on the first evening I talked about the dilemma or the balance between the short-term and the long-term. And it does seem to me as if thinking at the community level is a good way to make that link. Apart from this, I want to say a few words of thanks. First of all, obviously, I would like to thank you all for coming here. I would like to thank our partner organizations, or more than organizations, the City of Stockholm, the Swedish Parliament, both in the person of the speaker, representing the Parliament as a whole, and then more specifically the Foreign Affairs Committee that we also worked with very productively on Wednesday night's event, with MSB, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. I need to thank our donor, Per Taube. He's a great guy. He is, amongst other things, CIPRI's landlord. And through becoming CIPRI's landlord, he's got to know CIPRI a bit better, and he's wanted to then support some of our work financially. And if it weren't for him, we would not be able to be doing last year's conference and this year's conference. Obviously, we were really grateful and appreciative of the royal presence, His Majesty the King and Her Royal Highness the Crown Princess here. Gratitude to them for giving that time to the issue and showing their care and attention to it. But also a little bit more specifically to the court, to the members of the staff who helped fix this, because it needs some work to do that. Allow me to thank this place, Artipelag, and its founder, Björn Jakobsen. He's left now, but he was here for most of the period, and I think he was in the seminar on Wednesday evening as well. I won't give the advert for him and for Baby Björn, which is the brand that he founded. But just as some people love and depended on Baby Björn at different points in their lives, I mean, Artipelag is just fantastic. But part of what makes Artipelag so fantastic, I always like to do this. I'd like to give a thank you to Sweden, Swedish nature, to just the beauty of the surroundings. I'd like to thank the panelists. I think, I'm just so struck, first of all, of course, by the quality of the presentations, the quality of the engagement. But these people who have been giving up their time to come here, we know they have crowded agendas, and we really respect and appreciate that. It seemed like every time we turned around in this conference, we bumped into the head of a UN agency or the commissioner of something else. It was, we really are appreciative of people who have these important responsibilities and give their time in this way. And of course, none of this would be possible at all without the people from SIPRI who've been doing this work. It's not the right term to use to say that we've had an army of volunteers. We're a peace research institute, but we've had quite a lot of volunteers. I can't find the collective word, but I would like to thank some people in particular. I would like to thank Michael Salin, who has been the coordinator of this effort across several months, and I think whose own connections and networks have made it possible to bring some of this very diverse group together. There was a core team that Michael was leading and working with in the Institute. The members of it were, if you've seen somebody who today is wearing a blue jacket, but I forget what color it was yesterday, was it pink? Yeah. Moving around very, very fast, kind of blue flash, then that was Katarina Klemenko, who has been the really go-to person for the organization and the logistics of this. Ulla Hertig Nielsen, Stephanie Blenkner, Alexandra Manalash, Harry Thomas, and the Deputy Director of SIPRI, Jakob Halbrun, were the other members of this core team that put together this event, together with the staff at Artipelag. And I'm thanking everybody whom I've been thanking, from panelists through you to the court. Please remember as well them for the effort and the time and the care that they put into it. They all deserve an enormous round of applause. As Jan said, we are not completely sure about the next steps. I'm sure I think about three things. First of all, there will be next steps. That's one thing. We will carry this forward. The second thing I'm sure about is that I'm not sure about much else. We don't know what the modalities will be. We need to figure this out. We need to discuss it through. But the third thing that I'm sure about is that we will be attempting, at least, to convene you again next year, one way or another, coming together to be discussing these themes. So please stay in touch with us. We will stay in touch with you. If you haven't been tweeting crazily, do tweet crazily from now on. Every bit counts, every bit matters. Thank you all very much for participating in what I hope you agree has been a really wonderful conference. Thanks a lot.